Well, it's great to be here with everybody. Is this like too loud, too close to my mouth? Is this good? It's all right. All right. Cool. So I'm happy to be delivering the sermon today, and we're going to be following the lectionary like we do, and this was a really interesting passage for me. So I'm looking forward to sharing it with you. I actually got a lot out of it personally, and I hope it touches you the way it did me. So I came up with this dorky title. I just thought it was interesting. So we're going to hear about two sinners today, and sin is a topic that I have to say I'm kind of reluctant to talk about. I don't know if is sin anybody's favorite topic in here? Who enjoys talking about sin? Yana, you're weird, Yana. No, it's like so uncomfortable, right? And so we oftentimes like to just avoid it altogether. But we're gonna dive right into it. And so maybe Ricardo, if I could have the next slide. So this is my attempt at being a little bit scholarly. Drew, don't shoot me down. This is the Greek word for sin, and it's called, I must try to pronounce it, hamartia. And actually, the Greek word that's used in the New Testament is pretty similar to a Hebrew word, the meaning of a Hebrew word that's used a lot in the Old Testament to talk about sin. And I thought I'd start there just like for us to kind of define this a little bit, because sin is a pretty complex concept. It's got a lot of layers, a lot of different facets to it. And so it's kind of hard to capture it just in one word. But this word, hamartia, it means to miss the mark. I think other folks have used that definition here before. That's like the closest meaning. And in fact, the Greek word has been used by some of the ancient Greek authors. I forget who they were, but some famous Greek names. And they used it in the context of archery. So you shot the arrow, you missed the bullseye, you missed the mark. So I guess there's some use to that, but for me, I don't know, maybe it kind of gets me thinking along. I'm not sure if it's the right way to think, in that I'm thinking okay, miss the mark. I'm always thinking of taking a test in school or something, and I got a 75, and I really wanted to get a 95. So, maybe missing the mark could have a lot of different shades of meaning. One way that I think that, again, as you look at sin in the Bible, it's not just about not hitting a certain standard. It's also this idea that God had this beautiful design for us, right? That God had in mind when he made this universe, when he made us. There was this amazing, we were works of art, right? And this was supposed to be so wonderful and glorious. And because of sin, it hasn't turned out that way. So you can flip to the next animation. So this kind of comes to mind a little bit. Does anybody ever watch that TV show on Netflix, Nailed It? Okay. So anybody? So Nailed It is basically, you find some picture of some cake or whatever. And by the way, this has nothing to do with those cupcakes we just saw, right? But you try to reproduce. Really, no, I didn't know they were going to show that. But you try to reproduce this beautiful, perfect thing you saw on Pinterest, and then you're supposed to post what actually you came up with, right? So that's an example of what happened. So this is a humorous example, right? That there's this perfect standard, right, of beauty and glory, and who wouldn't want that to be their birthday cake, right? Well, I wouldn't, but somebody would want to have a unicorn birthday cake, and that would be oh, and then their mom makes the thing on the right? And you're oh man, one more reason to get counseling when I get older. But actually, sin is okay. We're laughing, but sin is pretty serious, right? It's deadly serious. And so actually, we can flip to the next slide. So, let's just take a minute. I thought it would get us all kind of engaged on this topic of sin, just to do a little moment of self-reflection. So on this slide are listed these sort of classical, does anybody know what these 7 words are? 7 deadly sins, right? Okay, thank you. So somebody a very long time ago came up with this list of the 7 deadly sins. this is not like strict from the Bible, right? This is just, someone came up with this. It's useful. And so it helps people, think about sin and all the ways that it can manifest itself in our lives. So here's the sort of group exercise, all right? So I want you to ask yourself 2 questions, all right? So question number 1, just look at this list, and I don't want anybody to answer out loud, but just what do you think is the most deadly of the 7 deadly sins? Like, which one do you think is the most destructive of those 7? Again, just keep it to yourself. This is just for you to think about it. Don't yell out any answers. Okay, everybody got one? Okay. Then I want you to answer a second question, and definitely don't answer this out loud, which is, which of these do you have the hardest time with? Which of these things? And does anybody need me to define any of these? Like sloth, laziness, gluttony, overeating, right? Some kind of like ancient words here. Okay, so which one do you think is the most deadly? And then which one do you personally struggle with the most? Okay. All right, so one more click. All right. So today we're going to talk about the sin of pride. And I'm not going to say if this one is the deadliest of the deadliest sins, but it's definitely toward the top of the list. And certainly some people have called pride the root of all sin. And I think it's definitely one of the most insidious, can really creep into your life, and it's a great vocab word, can creep into your life and cause all sorts of very serious consequences. And so we're talking about pride today because Jesus is talking about pride in the Bible passage we are about to read. So let's do this. I liked when Bruno did this last week. And actually, the kind of cool thing is this is the passage that's the one right after the one we did last week. So for whatever reason, in the lectionary, that's how they did it. Let's read it together out loud, okay? To some who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everyone else, Jesus told this parable. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood by himself and prayed, God, I thank you that I am not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and give 1/10 of all I get. But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. I tell you that this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. What's that? Okay. So, this is a parable. This is a fictional story that Jesus is telling to illustrate a deep spiritual truth. And this story is a great one. This is a great parable because Jesus packs the story with meaning. Ricardo, you can hit the button. So I want to talk just a little bit about setting and kind of set the stage for the story, because obviously Jesus was telling this parable to people who lived in the 1st century, and we are people in the 21st century. Just want to make sure that we all kind of are on the same page, right, in terms of what's going on here. So first, when you're thinking about a piece of literature, you want to ask yourself, what's the setting, right? So Jesus talks about 2 men went up to the temple. And of course, all of his audience would know what he meant by that, but just to make sure we all know what he meant by that. So Jesus was talking about the temple in Jerusalem, and this was Herod's temple, and it was the center of worship for the the Hebrew people at that time. This was the place where you would go to meet with God and worship the the Hebrew God. And, actually kind of interesting, from what I have read, much of what we do here every Sunday morning is more or less copied from what they would do when they would go to temple. So they would read scripture to one another, they would sing psalms, they would pray. And so that's the setting of this parable. It was a gathering of people. And I believe they would actually meet twice a day to have services every single day. Not everybody would go, right? But there were these services going on every single day. And people would go to the temple courts, gather together. And there's a lot of other details we don't need to go into, but they're separated men from women. So this would have been the place where all the men would gather, right? And stand and pray. So that's the setting. Now there's the characters. And there's these two characters, right? There's the tax collector, and there's also the Pharisee. And these characters also, Jesus is choosing very carefully because these characters have a very specific meaning, and people of those days would really connect to these two figures, and that there's a wealth of meaning in both of them. So we're going to go into a lot of depth on each of these characters. So first character I want to go into is the one Jesus mentions first, and this is the Pharisee. So let's read this again one more time. We'll all read together. The Pharisee stood by himself and prayed, God, I thank you that I am not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and give a tenth of all I get. So you've probably, if you've been around church a bit, you've heard the word Pharisee used a lot. But if you haven't, that's fine too. Let's just get, again, a little background into these guys. Who were the Pharisees? Who is this guy? So the word Pharisee, again, as far as I can understand, it actually means separated ones, okay? So these Pharisees, they were religious, very religious people. They were Bible scholars, scribes. They're the ones who, like, would, kind of transcribe the copy of the Bible, make new copies. They were from the priestly class. These guys had a very long, proud history that goes all the way back into the Old Testament in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, when the exiles came back to Jerusalem and they reestablished the study of the Torah, and people kind of came back to God. You could sort of trace a line back to that time. The Pharisees could trace themselves back to that. So they were kind of keepers of the faith, right? Very serious about about God and following his ways. In addition to that, these guys had become very powerful, very influential. So they were kind of like a political party. There were a number of different groups. You probably heard the word Sadducees used. There were some kind of like rivals, right? And they kind of got in with some of the political powers as well. So these guys were not just biblical scholars, but they were power brokers. They were very influential people. And another thing we know about them is that they came mainly from kind of the middle class or the artisan class. Like you may remember Paul, who was a Pharisee. Remember what his profession was? He was a tent maker, right? So the Pharisees, they were respected people, respected members of the community. And we also know that these guys were super strict about following the law. So the Pharisees, the scholars, they had actually gone through the whole Old Testament and had like numbered every single command in the Old Testament, like things you were said to do or things you were said not to do. Do you know what the number is? Anybody know? 619. That's right. So they had them all listed out, right? And not only that, but what they decided to do was they would create what they called a protective hedge. Lest you break one of those rules, they came up with like a whole nother layer of rules, such that if you follow those second layer of rules, you'll be sure you don't break the 619, right? So these guys take the law very seriously, right? And one example is tithing. These guys were really strict about tithing. And they went so far as that if they thought that someone else wasn't tithing, they wouldn't associate with them, or there were certain aspects of tithing. They just took everything to sort of the nth degree. So what do we gather from all of this, right? So this guy who's standing up here, right? He's He's someone who has a lot of respect, right? And he's someone that everyone is sort of looks up to. He has social status, social standing, right? Also, he's in the temple. This is his place. He is very comfortable in this place, right? When he comes into the temple, he's got his buddies there, they're high-fiving each other, and you know what I mean? Like, he's feeling very good about where he's at. And we can see that in the way it describes even his body language. You can see it in this painting. One of the great things about this parable is it inspires so much art. It's really fun just to like Google, tax collector and the Pharisee. You get so many cool pictures. So you can see this guy. He's like, strutting. He's like kind of like a peacock or whatever, right? And so it says in the passage, it said he stood by himself, right? So he's not even with the whole pack. This picture kind of shows two people. I'm sure there were quite a few people in the temple at the time. But he's standing up by himself, right? Because he's confident, right? He's a leader, right? So he projects this superiority and this confidence. But then we can look into his prayer, right? So let's see what he prays, right? Well, he starts out sort of nominally thanking God. Basically, if you want to summarize, like, God, thank you that I'm so awesome, right? Right? It's like, he's like, so he starts comparing himself to other people, right? So nominally he's praying, talking to God, but really he's mostly talking to himself, right? His prayer is all about himself. So he's like, I'm not like those people, the robbers, the evildoers, the adulterers. And then he actually goes beyond that, right? It's not good enough just to compare himself generically to bad people. He's got to find someone in the audience, like, I'm not as bad like that guy over there, right? Hopefully no one's starting to squirm here, because we do this, right? We find people and we can feel superior to them. We're going to get to more of that later. So he boasts to God. Not only that, so he's comparing himself to other people, and then you look at verse 12, and he's kind of recounting the things he's proud about, right? He's boasting to God about all the awesome stuff he does. I fast twice a week, and I give a tithe, a tenth of all I get, right? So if we were to summarize this character, then we would say he's someone who's, as Jesus said at the beginning, he's confident in his own righteousness, right? That's what Jesus said, or actually Luke said about this parable. And he's someone who looks down on others, right? So that's our first character, Pharisee. All right. So we can flip the slide. Let's look at the second character. I love this picture. This is the tax collector. So let's read this together. But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. All right, so a little more historical background on tax collectors. Another very common character in the Gospels, right? In fact, you may remember one of the 12 apostles was a former tax collector. Anybody know who that was? Matthew, that's right. I think also called Levi. And there's another, who's going to remember their Sunday school stories? A very famous tax collector, Zacchaeus, the little guy, right? In fact, Zacchaeus wasn't just a tax collector. He was like a tax collector boss, right? Probably he was like the executive director of tax collection for the city of Jericho. So he was a big tax collector. So who are these people, right? So we have to, again, kind of move ourselves back in time, first century AD. We're in Palestine, or whatever it was called then. And the Roman Empire, they were occupying these lands, right? And so they were a very brutal regime. And one of the things, the reason they had colonies was to extract money out of them, right? And so they set up this whole elaborate system of taxation. And in order to do that, they'd have these big bosses, like the Zacchaeus level. And then for every one of them, they'd have all these sort of subcontractors. Tax farmers would be one way to describe them. And those would be locals, people from the local population. The reason being is that they knew people, right? And they knew what they were up to. And they're like, look, I know you make more money than that, Eli. So you better give me some more money, right? So the Romans didn't care a whole lot about to what lengths these people went to get the taxes as long as the money was coming in, right? So there was a certain amount of latitude these people would get to, extort people, to, do shady things. And as you can imagine, with lots of money flowing around, that's exactly what happened, right? So tax collectors were not very well-liked people. As you can imagine, when you saw the guy walking down the street, you thought, hey, this guy's going to come shake me down, right? Not only that, for the Jewish people, there was such an insult, right, to being occupied by the Romans, and then to have another Jewish person be involved in this, right? They were like a traitor, right? They were a collaborator with the Romans. So, like, definitely not cool to be a tax collector. So people are crooked, collaborating with the Romans, and so they just got this terrible reputation. In fact, the religious people considered them unclean, like the Pharisees. They wouldn't even eat with these people, right? They wouldn't even associate with them. So if the Pharisee was someone who had high social status, the tax collector was exactly the opposite, right? He was at the lowest rung of the ladder, right? Right down there with the prostitutes and the you name it, right? So he really had no social status. And so when this person walks into the temple, how do you think he feels? Do you think he feels like, yo, I'm in my element, my bros are here, right? No, not at all, right? Imagine the looks this guy gets coming into the temple. Like, what are you doing here, right? And notice how it's captured in the text. But the tax collector stood at a distance. Why do you suppose he stood at a distance? God is everywhere, right? Ashamed, right? He didn't want to get in the middle of everybody because they didn't want him around, right? So he's feeling that shame, that rejection of the people who were there. Not only that, but it says he wouldn't even look up to heaven, right? So not only is he feeling ashamed because of the people there, but he's feeling ashamed before God, right? Because, most likely, and you can see from his prayer, he's not a very good person, right? He's a sinner. He really is, right? In fact, he calls himself that, right? He says, I'm a sinner. So it says that, if you also look at his body language, it says he beat his breast. Does anybody know what that would mean in that time and place? It's actually a fairly common gesture, it seems, in the Bible. Yes? Yeah? Yeah, it's being ashamed. It's an expression of deep sorrow, mourning. Another time you see it in Luke is after they crucified Jesus, and he was dead, and it said everyone went home beating their breasts. So there is a sense of like, what have we done, right? This was a terrible tragedy, right? So that's the feeling he's communicating. Let's look at his prayer. It's a pretty big contrast to the prayer of the Pharisee, right? Whereas the Pharisees is kind of long, and he's praying about himself and how awesome he is. The prayer of the tax collector is very short, right? It's basically like one very short sentence. God, have mercy on me, a sinner. There's no flowery language, right? There's no appeal to God. Have mercy on me because no, none of that, right? It's a plea. It's a helpless plea. I am completely helpless, right? The word he uses, sinner, is basically that word I mentioned earlier, hamartia, but basically like big sin. It's like, not just like I'm a sinner, but I'm like full of sin, right? That's how he describes himself. So the focus of his prayer is not on himself, it's on God. God, have mercy on me. So to summarize this character, here we have someone who has no status, right? Someone who is acutely aware of his bankruptcy when it comes to righteousness. He has nothing. He has nothing to offer God. He is completely desperate in his need for God. You can go to the next slide. So here's the two characters, right? So we have, as we said, the self-confident one who comes before God full of himself and all the great things that he thinks he's been doing. and we have the one who's completely broken, completely helpless, crying out desperately for God's mercy. Now Jesus says something really shocking. Let's read this verse together. I tell you that this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. So Jesus is saying that the man who was standing there ticking off all the reasons that he was righteous wasn't. And that the one who came in as an admitted bad sinner left justified. Let's talk about this word justified. What does that word mean? Justified is a legal term, and it means to go before a court and to be declared not guilty, to be declared righteous. So to be said that he was justified before God, it means that he's standing before God righteous. There's no condemnation to this man. So that's pretty amazing, right? And I think there's some pretty profound and a little bit scary implications. Let's dig into this, right? Let's talk about the Pharisee. So here's a man who, again, according to what everybody thinks, according to what he thinks, is doing everything right, right? He's got it all going on. But he's wrong. Jesus actually said that he didn't go home justified. That means he's not okay with God, right? That's not good, right? So he thought he was okay, but he's not okay. So he's in a lot of trouble, just as much trouble as the tax collector, but he doesn't even know it, right? That's like having cancer or something and not knowing that you have it, right? You're in deep trouble. He is completely blind to his need for God's forgiveness and mercy. How could this happen? How could someone who's so religious, someone who's working so hard to do everything right, how could they be so wrong? How could they be so blind and deceived and in such deep trouble, right? This is disturbing. And I think that we can point, three things that we've already kind of called out about him that are the reasons for this. First of all, he has a lot of social approval. He's got a lot of people surrounding him, telling him that he's good, right? So there's no one kind of saying, hey, look, dude, something's wrong with your life. You got to set things straight. Because he's a Pharisee. He's part of the in crowd, right? Everyone admires him. Everyone respects him, right? So if everyone around me is saying I'm good and I'm okay, then I must be okay, right? So that's one cause of his blindness. He's relying on what people say about him. Secondly, we can see this from the prayer he said before, he's grading himself on a curve, right? So he's saying, look, if I compare myself to the tax collectors and the robbers and I'm forgetting all sinners and what cheats or whatever it was, I'm doing really well, right? So it's like saying, hey, I got a 60% on the exam, but everyone else got a 40, right, or a 30. So this idea of we talk about sin as hitting the mark, it's like all my arrows are on the wall, none of them are on the target, and I'm just gonna walk over to the wall and draw a bullseye around where I actually hit, right? So that's another reason he's spiritually blind. So in the first case, he's looking to other people for his righteousness and his approval. In the second case, he's comparing himself to other people and thinking that somehow in that you're going to find the standard for what real righteousness is. And then finally, he had his spiritual resume, right? So basically, he had come up with this list of things that if I do these things, then that's righteousness, right? And again, and all this is being reinforced. So all my buddies think this is the right list. So I come to God with this, my resume, and God must accept me. So this is a problem, right? Because the problem is he's completely wrong. He thinks he's so right, but he's so wrong. What's worse than this is that it's not just himself he's affecting. He's actually affecting everyone around him, right? So this standard, this sort of false standard, is being propagated, right? So, look at how he devalues the tax collector, right? So the tax collector is someone who doesn't even belong here, right? Like, what is this guy doing here? Who does he think he is, right? And, of course, the tax collector picks up on this, right? And that's why he's so reluctant to even come in. He just stands in the back by himself, right? So really, not only is this man's point of view, his wrong-headed thinking, creating this serious spiritual issue for himself, he's actually acting as a barrier to other people coming to God, which is always the case, right? Our pride not only hurts us, but it actually has these ripple effects beyond us. So that's the Pharisee. But Jesus' words here also have a profound hope. And let's look at what it means for the tax collector. This is a man who had chosen a life of disobedience to God's rules, to his ways, right? He's aware of this, right? He says it in his prayer. I've been a big sinner. And here he is showing up before God. He has no confidence in his own righteousness. He has no spiritual resume. He has no approval. All the things the Pharisee had, he doesn't have, right? No one's telling him you're okay, right? He's at the bottom of the heap. He can't grade himself on a curve because he got an F, right? He defines the bottom of the curve, right? And his resume is garbage. He's got nothing on the resume, right? Didn't graduate high school. Sorry, I didn't mean it that way. But he has no resume. Nothing to hold up to God and say, accept me, right? But what's amazing to me, and this is actually a connection to last week, is despite all of that, he still shows up, right? Despite all the dirty looks, right? All the wagging, fingers, he still comes to the temple. Why? Because he's desperate. Because he has that inkling of faith that God cares and that God can save him. He wasn't going to let all of those barriers keep him from coming to God. And his faith was rewarded, right? Jesus says that he went home justified before God. That's a powerful thing. This man who'd lived this horrible life, messing everything up, has now been declared righteous, blameless before God. That's what that word means, justified. God heard his prayer, and he forgave him. But it's kind of crazy, right? Like, how can that be, right? How can the guy who's, got it all together, he comes away with nothing, and the guy who has nothing comes away with everything? How does that even work, right? Where does the power come from to forgive this awful person, right? And to justify him? This brings us to the next slide. So just a few chapters from here. Jesus is the one who will be the focus of everyone's scorn. He's the one that everyone will be talking about, saying what a failure he is. He's the one that gets lumped together with the sinners, right? In fact, they even crucified him between two criminals, right? He was executed as a criminal, the lowest of the low, in the most humiliating way possible, right? To be hung on a cross. He was drawn with a loincloth. He was probably naked. Everything about that was an act of humiliation, right? And the Bible is very clear. If you read later in Luke, this is chapter 24, I think it is. I mean, just the scorn is heaped upon scorn, right? Everybody gets their shots in on Jesus, right? So the religious leaders, they get their shots in. They stop by the cross just to sneer at him, right? They make it a point to go out there just to torment him, just to taunt him. You say, I told you so. You thought you were somebody. You thought you were the Son of God. You're nothing, man. Look at you hanging up there, right? Even the Romans, right? They don't even have any skin in the game. They're just like, whatever. They're just cruel. But, they mock him as well, right? And you may remember, like, how they put the robe on him and the crown of thorns and, like, a fake scepter, right? And they kept whacking him. Everybody, he is now at the very bottom in terms of everyone thinks he's a joke, right? And they even put this, like, sign on the cross. Do you remember that? It says, this man said he was the king of the Jews, right? Just to mock him. But you know what? That sign was right. He was the king of the Jews. And they don't even realize this, but that moment where he is being humiliated, where he is absolutely the object of everyone's scorn and shame, that's his coronation. That's his moment of victory. Jesus actually said that when I am lifted up from the earth, I will draw all people to myself. He said that in John. He was talking about his crucifixion. So, in this very strange way, Jesus is actually living out verse 14. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. When Jesus was absolutely humbled, in the worst possible way, that was the moment of his exaltation. The king wearing a crown of thorns, ascending his throne. He defeated sin and death. He took all the punishment for everyone's sins. And that's why the tax collector can be forgiven. That's why he can walk away justified. It's this amazing reversal. Those who exalt themselves will be humbled. Those who humble themselves will be exalted. I'm going to read just a little passage from Philippians chapter 2, verse 7 to 11. He, Jesus, made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Therefore, God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. He who exalts himself will be humbled. He who humbles himself will be exalted. That's the power of the gospel. Which brings us back to this parable. Why did Jesus tell this parable? Jesus says over and over again in all different scenarios, a lot of them involving tax collectors and Pharisees, that he came to seek and save the lost. That he's the physician. He came to heal the sick. He didn't come for the healthy. The problem is we need to realize we're sick. We need to realize that we're lost. If we are blind to our need for him, then how can he help us? So Jesus really wanted us to see that all of us need salvation always, all the time. It's not a one-time thing. It's so easy for us, especially those of us who have been in the church a long time, to start to fall into the sin of pride, right? Let's just go back through some of the ways this happens, right? First of all, we can just look to other people, right? It's a great thing to be in a church. Church is a wonderful thing. There's a lot of social aspects that we get by being encouraged by our brothers and sisters, right? But we also have to realize that sometimes we can get certain kinds of affirmation being in a church, and that starts to become like a substitute for us. And we start kind of defining our worth based on what other people are thinking about us and saying about us, right? We start to feel like we're okay because everyone treats us like we're okay, right? So we start to become like the Pharisee, right? You can even start to get little hierarchies, develop in some churches, right? Where some people are kind of in and they're favored, and there's other people that are kind of on the outs, right? This kind of stuff happens, right? So we have to be very careful that we don't look to approval of people as a measure that we're okay, right? That can blind us to our need for God. It's very insidious. And then likewise, we can do like the Pharisee. We can start to look down on other people. It's very easy to identify, if you look around a church, don't do this, but you can identify individuals where you're like, oh man, that person's really messed up, right? Or that person really wronged me. Like, how could they be like this? They're so messed up. How do they call themselves a Christian, right? We can get like that, where we start judging on other people. What happens when you start doing that? Just like the Pharisee, you become blind to your own sin, right? You're focused on that other person. You're grading yourself on a curve again, feeling good about yourself, but you're blinding yourself to your need for God. We can even do this with entire groups of people. I'm not going to start listing off people, but I bet you could think of some ideas of people that if they walked in this church right now, we might be shocked, right? You might be like, what are they doing here, right? Be very careful with this as Christians. Because again, it starts to blind us to our own needs, right? When we're focused on other people, what's wrong with them, we're not thinking about what's wrong with us. And then lastly, we start to take confidence in our religious acts, right? There's a lot of opportunities to do great things in the church, right? You can stand up and give a sermon. You can help with the offering. You can help in the parking lot. You can help on Wednesday nights. The list goes on and on and on. These are great things. You can have a bake sale. But don't make the mistake of substituting those things for righteousness, right? Don't build a spiritual resume and hold it up to God or up to yourself to say, I'm okay. I'm okay because I do these things, right? We don't want to come up with like a warped version, kind of the nailed it version, right, of true righteousness, where God is saying, there's so much I want for you. There's so much that I had in mind for humanity. We're like, yeah, I got it. Here's my version. It's good, right? Right? But there's great news. The great news is that despite all of this, we don't have to be ashamed to admit we need God's forgiveness, right? The gospel tells us that we are more messed up than we really want to think about, right? We don't like talking about sin. That's where I started, right? Why is that? Because we don't even want to think about how messed up we are, right? We don't want to consider all the ways we're broken. It's just very uncomfortable. But the gospel makes it safe for us to do that. Because it says, just like that tax collector, there's nothing he can't forgive. He's waiting to forgive you. He's waiting to save you. All he wants you to do is ask. So we have this ability to look at ourselves in that mirror that I showed earlier and not have to be afraid of what we see. It's okay. The truth is there, but God knows that already about us. And that's where he wants to come. And he wants to forgive us. He wants to restore us. He wants to heal us. He wants to grow us, right? So when we look in that mirror, maybe we see some aspects of the Pharisee. Maybe we see places where we are blinded by spiritual pride. Maybe some of these things have crept into our lives, certainly mine. I'll be honest, that's when I was going through this sermon. I was about 90% done, and I'm like, oh, that's me. I see where I'm doing that, here, and here, right? I think that probably is all of us, right? There are ways where we're, using other people as a standard and focusing on their sin, or where we're, all the things I said, right? We're doing that. But there are probably also ways where we're like the tax collector, right? Where we are willingly, knowingly taking God's standard and tossing it aside, right? But the good news is that God wants to restore us. He wants to justify us. That's why he told the parable. He wants us to come to him. No matter what, no matter where we are, he wants us to come to him. Do you want to experience renewal in your spiritual life? Do you want to love God more? Do you want to be more passionate for the lost, for sharing the gospel? If the answer is yes, look in the mirror. Allow yourself to see your sin. Allow yourself to recognize how desperately you need God. You are spiritually bankrupt in yourself, but God is willing to give you all the riches in Christ. That's why he came. That's why he hung on that cross. That's why he gave up everything so that we could have everything in him. So that's my sermon. I'd like to implore you, come to Jesus like the tax collector. Receive his mercy. You don't need to say anything fancy. It doesn't matter if you've been a Christian, you're not even a Christian at all. It doesn't matter if you've been a Christian your whole life. You need him the same. He wants to draw you to himself. Pray with me.